or at least the biggest part of it, and then we'll give you the background of these four beasts, and that may take most of our time, and we'll see see what we get through tonight. Daniel chapter number 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had three ribs in the mouth of it before the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it four wings of a fowl. The beast had also four heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were three of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the ancient of days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his heels was burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set, and the books were opened. I beheld them because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake. I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame. As concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, and yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near unto one of them that stood by, and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me, and made me know the interpretation of the things. These great beasts which are four kings which shall rise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom, and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. And of the 10 horns which were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes, and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the spirits, and prevailed against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down, and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times, and the dividing of time. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion, and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven, shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Hitherto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much trouble me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept this matter in my heart. Now, this chapter is the vision, Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts. And as he opens this chapter, he tells us when he had this vision this vision was in the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon. So we immediately know that this is out of order, okay? This chapter, chapter 7, actually precedes chapter 5 and chapter 6. And so the reason for that is the way the book of Daniel is written is all of the conflicts are assembled together, and that's chapters 1 through 6. And then all of the visions are assembled together, and that's chapter 7 through chapter 12. And so Darius, the events surrounding Darius and the overthrow of the Babylonian kingdom by the Persians is included in chapter 6, but then chapter 7 we would call a flashback, okay? Chapter 7 actually occurs chronologically before chapter number 5. But it's just included here because of the way the book is divided. It's the first year of Belshazzar's reign. So again, we know this is 541 BC. We know that Daniel is probably around 85 years old. Again, I want to stress that there are many, many interpretations of the book of Daniel. I'm not completely settled on mine, and so what I'm going to give to you is a summary or a preponderance of the resources that I have gathered, the different commentaries and the different outline studies and such that I have that kind of show most of the scholars kind of think along one of a couple of lines. And so I'm going to give you what is kind of the summary judgment of all of these guys together. But there's a bit of breadth in the interpretation from this point in Daniel on. I'll say that Daniel and John are similar. Of course, part of the key to interpreting the book of Revelation is understanding Daniel. And part of the key to understanding Daniel is being able to read forward to the book of Revelation. Daniel and John are very similar because they both write about apocalyptic themes. Both of them are very old men when they receive these revelations. They receive their revelation in visions. They're both referred to as being greatly beloved. And so there are, in this chapter, in Daniel chapter 7, there are 3 separate visions that are mentioned. There are 3 separate visions, and when you combine these 3 visions together, we learn about 6 different kingdoms. There are 4 kingdoms in the first vision, and then the 2 remaining kingdoms all have their own vision, okay? We have a vision of 4 wild beasts. We have a vision of a judgment scene here in the middle, and then we have a vision of the Son receiving a kingdom. And so these visions are all seen at the same time. They're all seen on the same occasion. And so the first vision we see here is from verse number 2 through verse number 8. And Daniel sees in this vision at night, he sees 4 winds, and these 4 winds cause a great disturbance upon the great sea. And out of the sea then, he sees 4 wild beasts, 4 wild animals that rise up. And so we can, through studying other Old Testament prophecies, and also now through studying history, because some of this that was prophecy at the time has already been fulfilled, we can be pretty sure what this refers to, okay? The Great Sea in the Old Testament is a reference to the Mediterranean Sea. And so we know that this reference gives us a geographic position for the nations that these beasts represent. So each of these beasts represents a different country, a different nation. And in biblical prophecy, the word sea, whenever you hear the sea, it's a general term that is a reference to the mass of humanity. All of humanity kind of assembled together, all right? More specifically, it is the mass of humanity, specifically Gentiles. It's not, it doesn't include God's people. It includes all of the Gentiles. And so here we see that the 4 winds of heaven are going to come, and they're going to blow upon the sea, and they're going to cause this great disturbance, this great storm. The four winds of heaven then describe the source of a commotion that begins to influence these four beasts or these four nations, and it causes a bunch of unrest. It causes the nations to be very disturbed, and out of this unrest comes these beasts, and there's a little bit of debate about what this is, but it seems like the preponderance of the evidence is that this is a reference to Satan. Satan is the prince of the power of the air. We know that from Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2. And so then these four beasts respond or correspond to what we have seen in a previous conflict. In chapter number 2, we see Nebuchadnezzar's colossal statue. We see the colossal statue of Nebuchadnezzar, which Daniel interpreted for us as being God's vision to Nebuchadnezzar about the coming nations of earth. And so these four beasts that arise from the sea correspond to the four separate metals that we saw in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter number 2. You remember what those were? It was a head of gold and a chest and arms of silver, kind of the midsection of brass, and then the legs of iron. Okay? The repetition of this material then, if you look at it from the human perspective, we see that as a concentration of wealth. We see it as a concentration of majesty and power and all of these different influences. You know, you see a golden-headed image. God doesn't see it that way. God sees each of these nations of the world as a sequence of wild beasts. And these wild beasts rise up out of the sea, out of the mass of Gentile humanity, and they devour one another. And so each one actually is worse than the one that precedes it. Okay? And so we're just going to jump right in. That's kind of all the background I'm going to give you. If we go through a lot of this, we're going to be in Daniel for a year. We don't want to be in Daniel for a year. We're going to be there long enough in these last few chapters. So the first beast that is mentioned is in verse number 4, and it's a lion. It's a lion that has eagle's wings, and the wings thereof get plucked off, and then this lion is lifted up from the earth, and it stands upon its feet as a man, and it's given a man's heart. So the lion is a nation which devours. It's a devouring nation. It's fitting that the first nation would be a lion, because a lion is the king of the jungle, right? It's the king of all beasts. And so there is no doubt that this beast corresponds to the head of gold. And so we're told the head of gold is thee, O Nebuchadnezzar, right? So we know that the head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar. It was a representative of the nation of Babylon. And so we know that the lion also represents the nation of Babylon. It is the first mentioned, and so it corresponds to that head of gold on the dream of chapter 2. A lion with eagle's wings, the face of a man. Again, very fitting. Those were the national symbols in places like Babylon that you can actually see. Archaeologists have discovered some of their coins, and they have on them lions with eagle's wings. And so this is a political representation of what we would call an absolute monarchy. The head of gold that ruled over everyone else, what we would say, no questions asked. It was absolute monarchy. There were no uprisings. There were no political upheavals that were tolerated. They were all put down. However, we see here that the wings were plucked. Again, there's a lot of conjecture amongst scholars, but most agree that, with some amount of speculation, most agree that this refers to Nebuchadnezzar, who left his conquests and began to turn to the great civil works. You remember when we talked about the nation or the city of Babylon and all of the ancient wonders that you could observe in the city. You know, the very thick, the very tall walls, the extremely large palaces, the huge fortress that was the city, the river that ran through the middle of the city, all of the different worship centers that they had, the hanging gardens, all of those things. And so Nebuchadnezzar at one point turned away from his conquests and began to focus upon those civil works in the city of Babylon. And so the scholars kind of say that was represented by having those wings plucked. Those wings represent kind of that swiftness of military conquest. And they think that because of what we'll say when we get to one of the beasts that's coming next that has a similar picture. This beast is raised upright. It's given a man's heart. Most say that this is a representation of the fact that for a period of time, Nebuchadnezzar had this condition where he went out. You remember when we studied chapter 4, he went out and he ate like the beasts of the field. And then after a period of time, he was recovered from this state, and then he became what we knew as a benevolent leader. He became very compassionate. It didn't last very long. After he was healed from that condition, he only lasted a year or 18 months, but for that short period of time, he became a very benevolent leader. And so that was him rising up upon the feet as a man and being given the heart of a man. Again, we're going to move through these a little bit quicker. We're going to do a summary later at another time. The next beast. Another beast, a second in verse 5, like to a bear, raised up itself on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth and between the teeth of it, and they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh. What is this speaking of? Well, what is characteristic of a bear? You've heard of the bear and the bull markets, right? We still use this same picture today. A bear is a downward sweeping animal. It is a nation which crushes. It is a nation which puts down other nations. The bear is, after the lion, it is the strongest of the beasts. It's the strongest of the animals. It's not as agile as a lion. It's still fast, but not as fast as a lion. It's still strong, but not as strong as a lion. Here's where it's different. It's more voracious than a lion, but it's also more awkward. You know, bears have legs that are a little bit longer in back than they are in front. It's a really fast animal, but it kind of runs a little bit clumsy, And so it's a little bit awkward in its movement. And so the bear emphasizes really overcoming by sheer strength. It's just absolute brute force. Just power, just overwhelming power. When you think about the Medo-Persian Empire, that's how they conquered their enemies. That was the characteristics of the Medo-Persian Empire. The Persians were very ponderous in their movements. They were very well thought out, and they just overpowered their enemies. They generally gained victory because they would throw a vast amount of troops, vast amount of resources at any of their enemies. And so what they would do is they would just overcome you by continuously just wearing you down. And they had overwhelming power. One of their kings, Xerxes, against Greece. When Xerxes led an expedition against Greece, he supplied a fighting force of 2.5 million men and the logistic train to keep them supplied. Now that's quite a feat for today, to have a fighting force of 2.5 million soldiers. Think about that in the 6th century BC. Gathering a 2.5 million man army and enough additional personnel to keep them supplied. Just overwhelming brute force, isn't it? And so the bear here, it corresponds to, again, Nebuchadnezzar's image, but it would be the silver on the image. It would be the next metal down. In chapter number 2 of Daniel, this bear corresponds to what we learned was the Medo-Persian Empire. But we have here an interesting detail, okay? And I'll just foreshadow you what's going to come in the next chapter. We're going to see some more beasts coming again. We're going to see this same history repeated for us multiple times in the book of Daniel. And each time it's repeated, we get additional details of these empires. We get additional characteristics about how these empires are going to come to being, how they're going to be removed from the scene, and we get additional characteristics about how they're going to rule. And so here, this bear raises itself up on one side. It has 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and they said to it, "Arise and devour much flesh." So these 3 ribs, we believe that this ribs are a signal of the 3 kingdoms of Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. And I'll say that because Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt formed a confederacy. They formed what was called a triple alliance. And this triple alliance was going to go out and they were going to resist. They were going to defeat the Medo-Persian Empire. They were going to resist this coming Medo-Persian power. It didn't work. They were destroyed. Hence, you see here that they see these 3 ribs in the mouth between the teeth of it. These 3 nations were crushed by the Medo-Persians. All right? They were all destroyed. So I'm gonna leave the rest of this picture here until we get to the next time we see this nation predicted prophetically. And we're going to move on to a leopard in verse 6, which has on its back 4 wings, and the beast also has 4 heads, and it has great dominion that is given to it. The leopard. When you think about a leopard, what do you think about? What are leopards known for? They're fast, aren't they? A leopard is not only fast, but can you imagine a leopard that also has wings? It's really fast, right? A leopard with wings is a nation which would spring upon its victim, and the method that a leopard uses to kill is it outruns you, it jumps on your back and clamps on your throat, okay? And basically, clamps your jugular vein, clamps your ability to breathe. It just prevents you from breathing and suffocates you after it catches you by its sheer speed. It's kind of the opposite of the bear, isn't it? So the Medo-Persians conquered by brute strength, just by brute force. We're just going to keep coming at you. But then there was another nation following the Medo-Persian Empire that conquered differently. They didn't conquer by brute force. They conquered by wisdom and speed. What nation was that? Greece. Of course. The leopard has 4 heads and it has 4 wings. These leopards, which are very agile and very graceful, they're very small of frame, but they're very strong, they're very swift, they're very fierce. That is a general description of the rapid conquest of the Greek, or the Greeks, under their most famous general, which is Alexander. Now, Alexander the Great was very notorious. He was a fantastically wise general at an extremely young age. One of the youngest generals ever. Conquered the entire known world at 32. He was notorious for very small fighting forces. Kind of the opposite of the bear, the opposite of the Medo-Persians. Alexander the Great was known for having very small fighting forces, but they were fierce, they were fast, they were very well equipped. They conquered the unwieldy forces of Persia and conquered the known world in under 10 years. So what he did was he actually used the Persian strength against them. They're so big, they're so strong, they can't move very fast. So the only way to beat them is with speed. And so he would come in and attack and be gone before they could even, maneuver to counter him. And so Alexander conquers the known world in just under 10 years' time. That's the 4 wings. Take a leopard that's fast to start with and then give it wings. It's really fast, right? 4 heads. We're going to talk about this again in another chapter that gives us more detail, but we're just going to give you a foreshadowing here. The 4 heads are likely to represent the 4 sub-kingdoms which Alexander's empire was divided into. And when Alexander died, he had no children, and so his kingdom that he had just conquered was divided into 4 subdivisions, and each one was given to his generals, and those were Thrace, Macedonia, Syria, and Egypt. And so this beast would correspond, again, if we're going to, if we're going to pin this back to chapter 2, that original beast that the original statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, this beast, this leopard, would correspond to the brass, that third nation down, the abdomen, the thighs of Nebuchadnezzar's image. Again, Nebuchadnezzar's image doesn't show us that division into 4 heads, into 4 different parts. So we're getting additional details in Daniel's vision. And then we're going to get more details in his next vision. There is a 4th nation. After this, verse number 7, he sees in his night visions a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, strong exceedingly, great iron teeth. That's important, because iron matches up with iron that Nebuchadnezzar saw in the legs. Has great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, stamped the residue with the feet of it. It was diverse, or was different from all the beasts that were before it. It had 10 horns. I considered the horns. Behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. This nation, it's a beast. We don't know what kind of an animal it's even like. He just says this is dreadful and terrible, and it's incomprehensible, and it's incomparable to any of the beasts that went before it. It is a nation that is uncharacteristic like any of the nations that have gone before. It's like no other beast that has ever been seen on the earth. It's unlike the 3 that have come before it. It's hideous to behold. Its parts that are comparable to nothing that is natural that we've seen on earth. We see here iron teeth, 10 horns. The 10 horns and the iron teeth are a direct correspondence to the iron legs and the 10 toes that Nebuchadnezzar sees on his great colossal statue. We know that represents the Roman Empire. The little horn and the mouth speaking great things then are new information. That's new information that's given to add some clarity. And so this is the one that really causes Daniel to get out of sorts, right? And so he sees some judgment. He sees a coming kingdom. And then he has to go ask. He has to go ask about this 4th beast. And so when he comes later in the chapter, he goes to this bystander in verse number 19, and he says, "Then I would know the truth of the 4th beast, which was diverse, was different from all the others, exceeding dreadful, teeth of iron, nails of brass, devoured, break in pieces, stamped with residue with his feet, 10 horns in his head, the other which came up, before whom 3 fell, even of the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. The same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them until the Ancient of Days came. And so we see here that he goes and he asks this bystander for more information. Kind of reminds me of the Apostle Paul, who had visions. Whether in the body I couldn't tell or out of the body I couldn't tell. And, he had to get more information. So there's really 2 figures here that need to be explained. And I'm not sure I'm the guy to explain them. This is where we get to the real difficult stuff, okay? We have the beast, and we have the 10 horns and the little horn. And this little horn here, it is mentioned that he will seek to change times and laws. He speaks great words against the Most High. In verse 25, he wears out the saints, and he thinks to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until time and times and dividing of time. So this is where we start having to fold in some of Daniel with some of Revelation and some of the other references that we know about this horn. These times here are a reference to the Hebrew Sabbaths, the Hebrew festivals. And the laws here, I believe, are a specific reference to the Levitical rules, which were regulatory for those particular Hebrew festivals. And so this little horn then, of course, you know that horns represent men. They represent rulers. They represent governors, kings. They represent a leading political figure. Okay? Today we might say a king, or we might say a president, or in this day you might say a monarch, you might say a king, or an emperor. Okay? They are somehow representative of a political leading figure. And so we have in this beast, this incomparable, incomprehensible beast, we have 10 leaders that come up. Okay? And then we have one little horn, which is a man who somehow becomes prominent among the 10. And what we're told here is that this one, he in verse number 8, there came up among them, among these 10, a little horn, and 3 of the first horns are plucked up by the roots. And in this horn, this one little horn, there are eyes like a man. He's a very eloquent speaker. And so this is a man, we believe, that is going to seek to make a covenant with the Jews regarding worship for a week, for 7 years. And he does so. He comes to power amongst these 10 leaders by defeating 3 others. Okay? And we're not exactly sure how this happens. It's likely, knowing his character, it's some political conspiracy. It's some sort of a back handshake deal thing, but he somehow speaks eloquently, and so through espionage, through these political dealings, through this insider trading thing, he defeats 3 of these, and he may kill 3 of them. We don't know, but he becomes the most prominent of these 10 leaders, and he basically becomes the ruler of this country, of this power. Now, he seeks to make peace with the Jews, and he wants to make a covenant with the Jews regarding this worship, and it's for a week. We believe this is 7 years. The word week in Daniel, every time you see the word in Daniel that's translated week, it actually means sevens. And so we believe that is 7 years. It could be, in fact, Daniel's 70 weeks is actually 70 sevens. We believe those are reference to years. And so halfway through, in other words, in 3.5 years, he's going to break this treaty And instead of allowing the Jews that freedom, he's going to set up himself to be worshipped. And this is done basically to annihilate all of the Jewish institutions. He comes in politically powerful, seeking peace with the Jews. And actually what he's going to do is 3.5 years later, he's going to try to annihilate all of the Jewish institutions. This beast then, the iron teeth, identify this beast with the iron legs of the image. And again, like I mentioned, we know this is the Roman Empire. The 10 horns correspond to the 10 toes. They're the last stage of the Roman Empire. We know, again, from Nebuchadnezzar's image, we know the iron, and then the iron mixed with clay. We know that the Roman Empire was actually split into two, the legs. You know, the eastern and the western part of the Roman Empire, then further split into 10. The little horn, the Old Testament and New Testament, both describe a terrible, mysterious person who is only going to be revealed in the end times. And there are many, many names by which we know this person. There are 4 references in Isaiah in the Old Testament. If you're writing down notes, and I know some of you are, write down Isaiah chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, and Isaiah chapter 14, verses 24 and 25. We'll turn to the next 2. Isaiah chapter number 11. We'll look at a couple of these references because I think you'll find them interesting. Isaiah chapter number 11. Look to verse 4. But with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. The wicked there is a very specific reference. Go also to chapter 14. If you're in Isaiah chapter 11, turn over to chapter 14, and you look at verse number 4 of chapter 14. That thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, and say, how hath the oppressor ceased, and the golden city ceased. So we see that he's called the wicked and the king of Babylon. All right? There's also 4 references to this person in the book of Daniel. This, in Daniel chapter 7, is only the first reference. He's mentioned in Daniel chapter 7, twice in Daniel chapter 8. He's mentioned in Daniel chapter 9, and he's mentioned in Daniel chapter 11. Let me give you his names in case you're reading ahead. You'll recognize him when you come across him. We're going to study him in future chapters. Here he's called the little horn. In Daniel chapter 8, he's called the king of a fierce countenance. In Daniel chapter 9, he's called the prince that shall come. And in Daniel chapter 11, he's called the willful king. All right? So all references to this same little horn. In the New Testament, we have references. Paul, 3 times, he calls him the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He calls him the son of perdition in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And he also calls him that wicked in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Did you catch all those references? They're all 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and they're all in verses 3 through 8. All 3 of those titles are in the same place. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 through 8. Paul calls him the man of sin, the son of perdition, and that wicked. Notice that wicked and the wicked were the same thing. And Paul was actually quoting Isaiah 11. John. This is the ones you're familiar with. John, in 1 John chapter 2, calls him the Antichrist. And in Revelation chapter 13, calls him the beast. So this is the fellow that we're going to study. Now, the wicked of Isaiah and that wicked that Paul mentions in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, I want you to know this. We believe that it's the same reference because both of those are singular. And they do not refer to a group of people in general. It refers to an individual person. That individual person, characteristically, is the embodiment of evil. Who else would you call that wicked or the wicked? Okay? So that is, of course, you know who it is, right? It's the Antichrist. We're going to study that in a lot more depth when we get to the coming chapters. Now, I'm looking at that clock on the wall, and I got 2 visions to go. This is just the first vision. Let me check my notes here. Man, we might be 3 or 4 weeks in this. All right. Let me do this. The second vision is the judgment scene. Back in chapter number 8. Or chapter number 7. Getting ahead of myself. Verses 9 through 12. This is a vision of the judgment scene. And this is Daniel given additional information about the times of the Gentile. This is nowhere found on Nebuchadnezzar's image, okay? Nebuchadnezzar has been given this image of gold and silver and brass and iron, and then some iron mixed with clay. So nowhere is this corresponding to what we already know in chapter 2. This is all brand new stuff. So this is a judgment scene, but it's a distinct judgment scene, different from the great white throne judgment, and it's different from the judgment seat of Christ. It's a judgment of nations. For the sake of time, we'll talk about that next week. Let me give you also what's happening in verses 13 and 14. I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. There was given him dominion, glory, kingdom. People, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. There's the key words. Which shall not pass away, in his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Guess which one that one is? There can be no mistaking which kingdom that one is. The 4 beasts all come out of the sea, and the 4 beasts are all destroyed. We have a 5th kingdom, also a wicked kingdom. This is the kingdom of Satan. It's going to be destroyed. Then in verses 13 and 14, we have the kingdom of the Son. We have a reference to a millennial kingdom, a kingdom that shall not be destroyed. Its dominion shall be forever. It will never pass away. That is the third vision. That is Jesus receiving the kingdom from the Ancient of Days. The Son of Man, of course, is Christ. The Ancient of Days is the Father. So if we see nothing else tonight, just understand, all this is my introduction. I haven't got to my sermon yet. You'll get the sermon next week, I suppose. All of this shows us one thing. The Ancient of Days, the Father, gives the Son of Man, Christ the Son, a future kingdom on the earth that shall never pass away. It shall never be destroyed. It's an everlasting dominion. A kingdom that all people, nations, and languages shall serve him. There is a coming kingdom. There's a coming kingdom on this earth. There's a coming kingdom on this earth that God will give to his Son, Jesus Christ. And that day is appointed. Just like every day on the colossal image that Nebuchadnezzar saw was a day appointed, and he couldn't change the day that his kingdom of Babylon was turned over to the Medo-Persians, and they couldn't change the day that Greece took over, and they couldn't change the day that the Roman Empire came into being. This day can't be changed. There is an appointment. There is an appointment for judgment that we see in this chapter, and there is an appointment for a coming millennial kingdom. I hope that's an encouragement to you as we look around and we see all the craziness going on in our society, and we're watching, dare I say, nations lose power. We're watching nations rise, and we're watching nations fall. But there's coming a kingdom. There's coming a day when Christ will rule. I don't know how far away that day is, but I know I'm going to see that day. And I'm looking forward to that day. So that's an introduction. We'll talk about the coming kingdoms next week. I thank you for your attention. I hope you haven't gotten frustrated with a lot of information coming at you about 4 beasts that are all Gentile kingdoms. We'll talk about the 2 coming kingdoms next week. Let's stand. Brother Derek, come lead us.